Let's talk about camera basics. Shutter speed, aperture, ISO. Let me explain. Hello and welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to talk about camera basics, so that's shutter speed, aperture and ISO. So as you probably know, when you look inside your camera there's a mirror that flips up and behind the mirror there's a shutter that's just in front of the sensor. So actually let me quickly show you that here. If I take this lens off, here you can see the mirror and behind that mirror is the shutter. So what happens when you expose an image is the mirror flips up and the shutter also comes up. And what that does is it exposes the sensor to light. Now depending on your shutter speed, you can create movement in photos. So if you have a fast shutter speed, you can freeze motion. I took some photos of a waterfall, which was actually where I shot the intro, to demonstrate this. So with a fast shutter speed, you can freeze the action. And as you can see here, you can see every single droplet of water in the photo. Now I'm going to show you a longer exposure. Here the water looks a lot more fluid because it was captured over a longer period of time. So what a longer shutter speed does to your photo is it sort of adds more motion blur and it makes motion look a lot more fluid. So a fast shutter speed will freeze action and a slow shutter speed will sort of add movement to your photos. You might actually know this from nighttime photography when you have cars going by and all you can see is just a ray of light. That's what a long shutter speed does. It will open the shutter for longer and during the 1, 2, 5, 10 seconds and it'll capture more of the movement. The second factor that will affect your exposure is the aperture. And I don't know if I can show you this, but if I close the aperture on the camera, you can see it closing in the lens. Do you see that? Okay, my camera doesn't want to focus on the lens, but whatever. And now you can see it opening again. So first of all, what that does is it allows more or less light to get onto your sensor. Say you're shooting at night and you don't want to expose for too long because you don't want that too much motion blur because you're trying to capture a portrait or something. You're going to have to open up that aperture to let more light onto the sensor. But that also has a secondary effect, which is a shallower depth of field. So the further you open up your aperture, the shallower your depth of field gets, which means that while this point will be in focus, this point may already not be in focus anymore. So the further you open the aperture, the more light it lets in, but you also get a shallower depth of field and hence more blur. And the more you close the aperture, the less light it lets in, you get a much deeper depth of field, like more will be in focus. And this makes sense for landscape photography where you want the whole thing to be in focus. So the third setting that affects exposure is ISO. Now ISO refers to the sensitivity of your sensor, meaning how sensitive it is to light. So say you want to shoot a cityscape at night. You want to close your aperture and you want to shoot with a short shutter speed. Why? Maybe you don't want a shallow depth of field, you kind of want more to be in focus in your image, and you don't want any motion blur due to a long exposure. So while that works, how do you get your sensor to be more sensitive to light? Well, for that you're going to have to crank up the ISO. So what that does is it will enable you to keep your aperture closed and keep your shutter speed short-ish, but still get a good exposure. Now the downside to this, because while you may be thinking that you can just crank up the ISO to infinity, you can, but the downside is that you're going to get a lot of noise in your image. You might remember this from the film days if you've ever shot film. If you buy a high ASA value film, you're going to get a lot of film grain. This is kind of transferred over to digital photography now, so the higher you crank your ISO, the more film grain you can get. In black and white images, I'm going to be honest, it looks good, it can look really good, but in color images, I'm not a fan. So to get a good exposure, you need to find a balance between shutter speed, aperture and ISO. And once you have those three balanced out, you can nail your shots every time. So those are the three basic settings that you need to know and master to get a good exposure. I personally don't shoot in manual because most times when you want to get that shot, you don't have time to finagle around with camera settings. So I shoot in aperture priority, I set my aperture, usually I shoot wide open. And honestly, no one's ever going to ask you, did you shoot that in manual? You didn't? Oh my god, you suck. Actually, I'm going to have to intervene there because that is simply not true. I was actually berated once for shooting in P mode by someone who obviously was not a photographer. And she was like, dude, you're shooting in P? Like, really? Yeah, I am. Honestly, who cares? If you get the shot, you get the shot. Anyway, back to the video. So yeah, that's the basics of photography. If you have any questions, drop them down in the comments. Like this video if you liked it, subscribe for more, and I will see you guys in the next video. So say you're shooting at night and you want a... I'm blanking. So say you're shooting a cityscape at night. You don't want a wide open aperture because you don't want a shallow depth of field. Let's do that again. So say you're shooting a cityscape at night. So what do you do? How do you get a short shutter speed or shorter exposure without having to compromise on